It was David Damas with his project that eventually got me to Clyde River, although, as I think I mentioned earlier, I originally was supposed to go to Tom Bay, and really only supposed to go to the field for a month or two to do this collection of traditional artifacts, but sort of made with modern materials. And eventually I found things like kudliks, seal oil lamps made out of the tops of 45-gallon oil drums, various things like that, harpoons made out of brass. And eventually all this, I collected this stuff and sent it down. But when I was there, well, getting there was interesting because I flew on Nordair from Hamilton to what's now Iqaluit, Frobisher Bay. And the weather was horrible and there were no planes going anywhere. And in fact, I didn't have a ticket to anywhere. He said, you find someplace to go. And I heard that there were still people living on the land in Mitimatalik, around Mitimatalik, at Clyde River, and near Pendertu. But somebody said, oh, there's somebody named Jean Briggs at Pendertu. Well, you know, anthropology, you sort of a solitary recreation. So I didn't know Jean Briggs, but I had read her book. As I said, I didn't meet her for many years afterwards. But having read her book was the smartest thing I ever did, to be absolutely honest. But I'll get to it. So anyway, every day, and in Frobisher Bay, I gravitated to the Catholic mission. Father Mias was there from Chesterfield, who I knew from Chesterfield. So he let me sleep on the floor at the rectory. And every day I would go down to the airport and nobody was flying, you know? And so I wasn't gonna buy a ticket till I knew I could go someplace. And Frobisher Bay in those days was a real frontier town. I mean, other than the Inuit in Happy Valley, it was all government people. You know, the Hudson Bay store was in Apex, but the grocery store was in Frobisher Bay, but if you wanted ammunition or fuel, you had to go to Apex, and there were no taxis. I remember walking back with a gallon of kerosene to take ultimately the Clyde River, because I had a Primus stove, I had a sleeping bag, I had a couple of rifles, and a portable typewriter, which I still have someplace. But I didn't know where I was going to go. So I spent a couple of weeks in Frobisher Bay, probably driving Mias crazy. And finally I walked down to the airport and they said, oh, we've got a flight going to Clyde later today. I rushed back. I found a guy from government who let me throw my stuff in his truck and drove it over to the old terminal, which was the hangar, basically, and bought a ticket to Clyde River. Nobody knew I was coming. Of course, there were no telephones in those days. They had a radio phone. They had a 4-hour-a-week sched, 2 days a week, 2 hours each day. So I arrived. It was old DC-3. And it was myself and 3 women coming back who had given birth in Frobisher Bay. And so, fortunately, I landed at Clyde, and the airport's about 7 or 8 kilometers out of Clyde. And it was a good thing these women were coming back because the settlement manager had driven up to meet them in an old Bombardier half-track. And here I'm the last person off the plane. In fact, Clyde, at that time, when you flew from Frobisher Bay to Clyde, it was Frobisher Bay, Kikatajuak, or Broughton Island, and then Clyde, and then the plane turned around. It didn't go all the way up island. And so I got to, came off the plane, and he looks at me, he said, are you a mechanic? I said, no. He said, oh, we were expecting mechanic. I said, no, I'm an anthropologist. And it was like, kind of, what's that? He actually was a really bright guy. He had come up with the Hudson's Bay Company, married to Enoch, which meant he had to leave the bay, and took a job with the then GNWT, the Northwest Territories government, as a settlement manager. And I had never seen him after he left Clyde, but he retired in Yellowknife. He became, I think, the chief finance person for the NWT once upon a time. Anyway, so he said, well, hop in the, the bus. And my next thing about Introduction to the North is we're driving back, and it's bumpy as hell, and there's barely a road, and all of a sudden he hits a bump, and the steering wheel comes off. And he hands it to me, and he takes out a pair of vice grips so he can steer. It had skis on the front and tracks on the back. And this is like, what? So he said, where are you staying? And I said, I don't know. So I put a tent up on the beach. I had a little 2-man tent. And I'm on the beach. Don't know anybody. And he was nice enough to give me a cup of tea, and I explained what I was doing. I'm pretty sure he thought I was nuts. But he gave me the names of a couple of younger people who spoke English. Very few most people over 30, 35 didn't speak much English. And to this day, that first cohort of guys roughly my age, some of whom spoke English, are still my friends. We hunted together for many years, over 50 years. I'm now the oldest of the group. We spanned age from about, in my years, they would be, the oldest guy would now be about 77 if he was alive, and the youngest is about 70 now. But in any case, so that morning I got up, and I thought, well, I kind of had an inkling I was going to do cultural anthropology. I hadn't set my mind on it. I still had this idea of going back and doing archaeology, but Damas kind of wanted to, he kind of discouraged me about it, and he could be pretty forceful. But in any case, so I got up and I said, well, I've got nothing else to do. And there were all these freighter canoes on the beach, and I saw guys coming down in 1s and 2s going out seal hunting. It was September. Sea lift wasn't in yet. It would be coming.
What was the year, just the year, that year?
1971. 1971. Sorry, I forgot. This is also a chronology, even though I skip around. So I started, counting boats and looking at guys. And finally, there was one boat left. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And here's this guy. Turned out to be a guy named Salomone Natanai. And Salomone's trying to push this 24-foot freighter in by himself. So I come over, push, and I hop in. And off we go. And I shot my first seal that day. And we were out about 8 or 10 hours. I was cold as hell. Because Damas he had me buy a down parka, and there was nothing like Canada Goose, so it was a Eddie Bauer Mount Everest parka, which basically with the sea spray wound up being 2 layers of nylon with all the down collapsed, So anyway, so here I am around town, and this is kind of my daily routine, checking who's going off on the beach. And Clyde was about 225 people wandering around. Finally, sea lift comes in after about a week. I helped work on sea lift, unloading like everybody else for biscuits and tea, and I don't know, $1 a day or something. I can't remember. But I got to meet Inuit doing this stuff. And so I met a young guy, Elijah Tugulrak, who now lives in Mitimatadak. Elijah was 12 to 14, I don't know for sure, but he spoke really good English, very, very well. And so he kind of was an interpreter for me. Not that I had any real things to be interpreted, except kind of gave me little language lessons, a few words here and there and so on, because I thought I was only going to be there 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. And so one day, I was up by the Hudson's Bay store. Was about 4 times the size of this office at that time. I was up at the bay having a smoke with a couple of guys, and which became sort of all the interviews I've ever done have been on the steps of the store, having a smoke. And days when I'm stuck in the village, I'll just hang out on the steps of the store, because the conversation always comes around to something I want to talk about. If I let Inuit lead it, we talk about hunting, about the old days, about this, about that. So he said, there's somebody you should meet. And I said, I think I've met everybody in Clyde, at least seen them. He said, no, these people don't live in Clyde. They live up at Eglinton Fjord, Abattiok, which is about 60 to 80 kilometers north of Clyde. I don't have a map up anymore. I used to have a big map, which is folded up there. But it was that man. He was the head of, he was the Isumata at Clyde, at Abattiok. And I thought, well, this is, if I'm going to find interesting artifacts and stuff, I'll go up there. So they only had dog teams. They were just mechanizing in Clyde. So snowmobile, there were snowmobiles, but not everyone had a snowmobile. There were still 6 or 7 dog teams. But they had nothing but dog teams. And he came down with his brother and his son. His oldest son was, at that time, about 16. He just passed away this winter. And so with Elijah interpreting, they agreed to take me back with the idea that I'd be there for a couple of weeks. Well, I was there for 15 months. But and it was an interesting trip because it was late September. There were only a few centimeters of snow, and running dog team over rocks is a real job. But I was willing to pull my weight as best I could, and I had about a month's worth of food. In those days, you didn't have much in the store. So I had pilot biscuits, some flour, canned bacon, best bacon in the world, Danish bacon, and Danish butter. And I don't know, a couple of boxes of oatmeal or something. But enough that I figured would last me for a month. And so I went up with these people, and in fact, it took us 3 days to get up there because the travel was so rough. Normally by dog team in the winter, it would take 6-7 hours. And actually those nights that we were on the trail, there were, I think, 9 people from Abattiok and myself. We all slept in one tent, and the kids slept horizontally across our legs. So once you were in the tent, you were in the tent for the night. And so we got to Abattiok, and I remembered something in one of the, to me, big themes or sub-themes in Never in Anger is generosity. And so we got there, and I turned to Piamituk, because I kind of, through gestures and stuff, he asked me, they were living inside kammak, canvas inside kammaks, because he said I could live with him. And he said, what did I want to do with all this stuff? I said, well, it's for you. And I gave him all my food. And plus what little fuel, I had a couple of gallons of kerosene and stuff, a couple of boxes of ammunition. So I think he was quite surprised. In any case, so I moved into his kammak, and there were myself and his family of 8. And we were sleeping on a gravel igleak. It was heated with 3 seal oil lamps. It was the largest of the kammak. His brother had one with his family of 3 children, and then his son with his wife, and they had a newborn child. So there were 3 houses. We had about 150 dogs. They were not tied up. Cleanest place I've ever seen. They ate anything organic. So there was never anything, but you couldn't let the kids outside alone either. And so outside of a period where I kind of was sick for about a week, I think I had eaten too much seal fat. Their entire diet outside of bannock, and there were 3 essentials in our diet from the store: flour, tea, and tobacco. And I also had a month's supply of tobacco, which I shared with everyone as well, which was really hard on me, but I managed to temper my smoking. And so I moved in with Piamituk for about several months, eventually built another kammak attached to his, where I and a nephew of his who was about that time about 14, Laimiki Palluk, Limekey and I lived in there, heated it with seal oil, and we had my Primus, went out every day hunting and gradually collected stuff. And it was a good thing I kind of had it in my mind that I'm going to stay a while. This is interesting because the next plane to Clyde was 4 months later, just before Christmas. So, by that time, and we had no, I wrote letters. They went out whenever a plane went out and so on. And I started writing to actually the woman who became my wife. So anyway, and so I started going out hunting, seal hunting, polar bear hunting, and so on. And the HTA at the time, what was then the Hunters Trappers Association, before it became HTOs under Nunavut, when I came back after 4 months and people realized I was going to stay, I came back to Clyde because they came into trade. They would come into trade every 3-4 months, mainly sealskins, occasional polar bear, which at that time were worth about $200. The HTO gave me a hunting license, so I was a legitimate hunter. Because anything I shot, which was very rare, to be absolutely honest, went to, like everyone else, at Abakdiok, everything we caught went to Pumituk and it was redistributed, usually through commensal meals. And I just became really interested in Inuit social organization and how it was everything in life, who you hunted with. Because down in Clyde, because it was 200 people, it was mainly 7 extended families. Although I barely knew what an extended family was at that time. I mean, I did Stones and Bones. What cultural anthropology I read just went right out of my head, basically, as an undergraduate and even as a master's student. Although I had Damas's Igalingmuk Kinship with me. And the other book I had to read was Elementary Structures of Kinship, and I've never made it past the intro. I'm afraid Levi-Strauss defeated me, like Foucault did. My wife is a big fan of Foucault, but I've never managed. So I learned to hunt with a harpoon, run a dog team. They made clothing for me. And I learned things sort of the Inuktitut way by watching. I still believe participant observation is one of the most important things you can do. We ask way too many questions, and they're always why questions, which I found did not go over well. And Pumituk would give me language lessons of sort. It's easy to learn nouns. It's really hard to learn grammar. I don't consider myself, I'm nowhere near someone like Louis-Jacques Daudet. I mean, to me, he's the most amazing man. He can switch from language to language, from Inuktitut to French to English, and I don't know what else Louis-Jacques speaks. To me, he's absolutely amazing. But I would say I probably speak like a 10-year-old or something, But I know idioms that young people today don't know. And I got it in my head I'm here, and I'm really interested in the social organization, but most of my life, like 8-10 hours a day, is spent out on the ice. I've got to find a project. So I started doing things that, to backtrack just a bit, when I left Hamilton, in the airport, I picked up a Scientific American. And it was their energy issue with an article by Bill Kemp, Energy Flow in a Hunter-Gatherer Society. He became my PhD supervisor. But I read this over and I said, I could kind of do this. So I started weighing seals and cutting up seals and weighing the constituent parts, the way Inuit cut them up and stuff. I mean, I never used any of that data till many years later. But I thought, well, I got nothing else to do. People thought I was nuts. Here I am out at -20 with a canvas weighing the blood and every part. learned to build a snow house, with people. I mean, I don't consider myself super competent by any stretch of the imagination, but I found that being with Inuit was so much fun. There were hard times, but there was so much fun. And they were the most generous people I've ever met in my life. I still think part of my philosophy of child rearing came from living in Abatiok. And I was there, it was just before Christmas, my first Christmas there. And we went through a rough period with really bad weather from late October to almost the end of November, where we couldn't go hunting. And we wound up eating up all the dog food that we had buried for the dogs and boiling sealskins to make soup for the kids and giving puppies to the kids for food. And that went on for almost a month. And it was interesting because it's something I had not seen amongst Inuit, the tension that built up. I mean, we were hungry. There wasn't enough snow to really go into Clyde. We couldn't go out hunting and so on. And finally, things improved, and I went out with Piumituk and we got a polar bear on the land at the den, which would be illegal these days, but in those days. And so suddenly we were in really good shape. So, and then about 2 weeks, a little bit more than that before Christmas, well, sometime in early December, I guess it was, they decided, we'd been eating seal this whole time, and then polar bear. And they had some narwhal mata as well. And I just was eating a nuktitu food, And he was sending his, Piumituk was the isumata. He made all the decisions in camp. He sold the seal skins, bought what was essential for the camp, and then distributed whatever money was left. They were probably the only people in Clyde who were not in debt to the Hudson Bay Company, because their needs were so few. They may have had great wants, but their needs were so few. So his brother and his nephew and his son were going up near the Barnes ice cap to fish, to get Arctic char, which meant fishing through the ice with Leicester, with Kukava and the Kakevak. And I decided to go with them. And we went up there by dog team. Took several days to get up there. Dogs don't travel very quickly. And then we started fishing. And to chop out a hole in the ice, all we had were the unnang, the shaft of harpoons. You can imagine chopping a hole this large. So I always knew when someone was cold, because you would open a new hole trying to warm up, including me. And I wasn't very successful with the kakevak, but I did have tobacco, and people were happy with that. And we were there about 3 weeks, and we had run through our fuel for the Primus stove about a week earlier. So we were eating frozen fish the rest of the time. And then we ran out of tobacco and sugar, and it was time to go home. And on the way back, we cut across a trail of wolf tracks. And so wolf was worth almost as much as a polar bear at that time. Seal skins were $8, $9. Polar bear, $2 to $2.50. Well, probably much more at auction, but the Hudson's Bay Company screwed you terribly at that time. And wolf was worth a couple of $100. So, they were fresh wolf tracks. Well, we were starting to cross a small river, and I guess there had been an overflow. And I was a little bit off. We had 3 sleds, and I was on the last sled, and it broke through and landed on the ice below. So there was a layer of water, thin ice, water, and then solid ice. We had to unload our sled with a whole bunch of gear. And all I can think in retrospect, was some water splashed over the tops of my comics. And then we got out. We couldn't find the wolves, and we reloaded, and took off. And I found myself really cold. And finally, because dogs go so slowly, I ran over to another sled and I said, I'm really cold. And by this time, I could speak enough Inuit. So we finally stopped. I'd been walking and walking and walking. I couldn't warm up. And we put up a snow wall, pulled off my boots. I should say that morning I had taken the temperature. It was minus 42 Fahrenheit, which is minus 41 Celsius at the ice cap, at the Barnes ice cap. And the soles of my feet were gray. So changed my socks, put on new duffels, put on my kamiks, took a caribou skin mattress, and cut and made an overboot. They don't last very long, and off we went. And by about 7 that evening, it was the dark period. It was full moon. I remember that. And we came to a snow house we had built on the way in. And I had a bit of a stub of a candle. And we got in and I took off the candle, and both my feet were black. So I was in pretty rough shape. Anyway, it took another 2 days to get back. A lot of walking and so on and so forth. And I actually would, I don't think if I'd been with Inuit, I wouldn't have made it. There's no doubt about that. And I remember only when I could see the light from the Kammuk from a few kilometers away, because they had a window of plastic from the dump, one window in the Kammuk. I could see a glow. I knew I was there. And got in, pulled off my boots. I was black to the ankles. So had a meal. I had to cut my boots off. My feet were so swollen. My glasses, at that time I had broken my plastic glasses, and my backup glasses were metal framed. They had frozen into my nose. I couldn't get them off for about a half hour, and I still have a scar when it's cold across my nose. My hands were all chilblained, like everyone else's, my cheeks and so on. Anyway, there I was, about 6 hours after we got there. 2 guys who became very close friends of mine came through by snowmobile to go polar bear hunting. And they bundled me up in a sleeping bag, strapped me down on a sled, and took me to Clyde, to the nursing station. The nurse and I were not real friends, but she was a Pentecostal, and we didn't have a lot to talk about. But I used to read all her Time magazines if they were there around and so on. Anyway, she said, you're going to have to be medevaced. So she called for a medevac, and wouldn't you know it, a storm blew up. And it was 7 days before the medevac came in. So to wrap this all up, it's a long story, but they boarded me with new teachers who had come in for the school year. They were a little bit younger than I was. I was probably 25. And this is an awful part of the story. I'll be very quick. Anyway, they let me stay at their place. And I got up the first night, and it was a little bit different from the Inuit houses. And so I wanted to go to the bathroom, to the toilet, and I tripped going in. It had a little step up. The next morning, they had to go to school. It was getting towards the end of Christmas. I'll just finish this. And the husband came in, and he brought me some tea. Everybody knew I was a big tea drinker. And she came with biscuits. And she said, I found this piece of burnt wood in the hallway. And later when they left, I went to get up, and I had knocked off one of my toes. Anyway, eventually I got down to Frobisher Bay. They told me that they thought my left foot would have to be amputated. And I said, well, I don't want that to happen. And they said, well, you'll have to go to Montreal. I said, no, I'm not going to Montreal. I'll stop there.